Hello, guys, and welcome back to What's Up Doc podcast, the documentary review podcast. I am your host, Gemma Delaney, and this is episode 2 of season 2. So, if you guys follow me on social media, we are at What's Up Doc podcast. That's on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. You'll already know what this episode is about. It is, of course, the most dangerous animal of all. So that was based on the 2014 bestseller, which was written by Gary Stewart and then co-written by Susan Mustafa. So if you haven't read the book or you haven't seen the press release leading up to the release of this documentary, what's it all about? So Gary Stewart is this guy. He's in his 30s and he's adopted and decides to go and look for his biological parents. So nothing massively out of the ordinary then, first of all. But again, if you have seen the press release, you'll know this. He comes to believe that his father is the Zodiac Killer. So the Zodiac Killer, just like infamous, was never captured and killed couples back in the 60s and 70s in California. So that's basically the premise for this documentary. So it's a 4-parter, this one. And the first episode kind of focuses on the story of his parents and his biological parents, I should say. And, you know, his own kind of journey and what led him to go on the hunt for them. So basically, Gary Stewart, from the get-go, you can see this guy has got issues. And I mean that in the nicest of ways. But you can just see there's, you know, it's an old Irish saying, there's a want in him. There's definitely a want in this guy. He just... he speaks about how he doesn't feel like he belongs, and that, you know, this yearning and need to be loved, even though, you know, by all intents, it does seem like his adopted parents and adopted family were absolute sweethearts, absolute dotes, and he really struck lucky with them, and, you know, he feels loved by them, but there's just this want in him. He needs to know who he is, where he's come from, and, you know, that want that adopted children sometimes have. So he goes out on this quest to find his biological parents. It's pretty easy to find his biological mother, and he does, and they kind of create a relationship. And then whenever he presses her on details of his biological father, he's just getting very kind of, you know, vague. She's very evasive about it. She doesn't want to talk about it. And he says, you know, that she only kind of seems to remember what suits her, basically. And with regards his birth father, she says, yeah, he was this guy. I think his name was Van something or Best something or whatever. She acts like she can't remember his name. So he kind of looks into it further, only to find out that kind of no wonder she doesn't want to remember anything about him. I don't know what the right terminology for this is. I don't know whether you'd say they eloped or that she was abducted. And the reason I say that is because she was 14 at the time when she fell pregnant for his father. And he's like 27. The dad is. So, yeah, basically his father, he comes to discover, is this guy called Earl Van Best Jr. And his ma's Judy Chandler. And Earl basically happened on Judy, allegedly getting off her school bus, fell in love with her, and then pursues her. And, you know, they have this kind of date in an ice cream parlour, and it's, you know, there's a recreation in the documentary, and it's all painted very idyllically. And yeah, basically they go on the run together, whatever way you want to say that they eloped or that he abducted her. I mean, the father's a bloody pedophile, like, she's 14. But yeah, they go on the run and they're together for like 15 months. And while they're on the run, Judy, his ma, finds out that she's pregnant with him. So yeah, this is kind of, you know, the fascinating bit, I suppose. The father turns. He gets quite nasty with the mother. They don't really go into details about it, but what happens is that She comes home one day to wherever it is they're staying. Again, they're on the run at this time, and the baby is gone. Gary is gone. And she asks Earl what's happened, and he said, look, he's after getting rid of the baby. And basically, she leaves him. She goes back home, and her mum and dad are like, there's no problem, you coming back home. That baby can't come back home with you, so she has to put Gary up for adoption. His father then is caught by the police. He's tried and he's sentenced to 4 years in jail because obviously Judy is minor, and he is a raving paedophile. So yeah, basically that's kind of where the trail on the father kind of dries up. So in the second episode, Gary then, he's going on the hunt for his father. And when he's going on the hunt for his father, he finds the mugshot from when he was arrested for the abduction of his mum. And so he's doing his research and he's finding it really hard to find information on the dad. And, you know, Gary kind of discusses this, or he describes it, that he's sitting down one night and he's watching the telly, and an old cold case episode comes on the telly, and it's about the Zodiac Killer and his identity. And obviously this elusive Zodiac Killer was never caught. But what was got while that case was ongoing was an eyewitness description of what the Zodiac Killer looked like, and, you know, a police sketch artist sketched up the impression, and this flashes up on the screen. And so there's this very dramatic bit in the documentary where Gary describes this, and he talks about like seeing this photo, and then, you know, it skips to Gary's son, and the son is like, you know, he can't talk, he's screaming, he's shouting and roaring, he's running around and looking, and he's like, Dad, what's wrong? And so basically Gary comes to, he finds the photograph of his dad and he puts it up beside the picture, the sketch artist impression of the Zodiac Killer. And I mean, yeah, you've got to admit there is more than a passing resemblance. There's a very striking resemblance between the two of them. And so he's like, Jesus Christ, could my dad be the Zodiac Killer? So what happens then is that he delves into his father's history. He finds out some interesting little tidbits. So he tries to track the father after the 4 years that he spent in jail, or even beforehand, kind of, you know. So he learns that that when he was caught after abducting or absconding with Gary's mum, he was subjected to electroshock therapy in this like psychiatric kind of facility. And as we know, you know, that kind of shit, like, we don't do that anymore. We know now the effects, the repercussions it can have. It can totally fuck up a person's brain and mind. So that's the first thing he finds out. He then finds out that after he got out of jail, that the father made his way to San Francisco, which was kind of the hubbub. This is where all the Zodiac Killer's killings took place. And that he started hanging out with a member of Charles Manson's family. So those of, you know, Sharon Tate murder fame. And as well as that, he was like chummy and well in with the head of the Church of Satanism as well. The founder of that church, in fact, was one of his good friends. So, you know, Gary's like, Jesus, you know, my dad was a sketchy kind of character. Delves into it further. And again, like, all of the evidence that the documentary is shown, I suppose, is linking back to the Zodiac Killer. So it starts with these kind of smaller tidbits where you kind of go, okay, this is just painting the picture and showing how this guy could be massively disturbed. It then starts talking about Gary's father's upbringing, so Earl's upbringing. So he was abandoned by his own father and then was left to be raised by his mum, who was, by all accounts, pretty promiscuous and enjoyed the company of gentlemen, and had many a gentleman caller come to the house. And, you know, they talk to the father's friends and they say how, like, you know, you could hear the headboard banging basically up in the ma's bedroom, and, you know, just a bit of a turbulent childhood. And so, you know, again, this is painting in your mind that, maybe he hates women, you know. And obviously the Zodiac Killer killed couples, but the slayings of the female halves of those couples were particularly brutal. You know, the women were stabbed multiple times and all this kind of thing. So again, it's painting that picture for you, that narrative for you. And then it goes on to explain that before his father abandoned Earl, he was in the war. And not only was he in the war, but he was basically, he broke code in the war. I don't know what the right terminology is. A code reader, code, whatever. He intercepted code. And that was his forte when he was in the army. And I mean, again, if you're familiar with the case of the Zodiac, you'll know that he wrote these messages to the police and to the media in this cipher, this encoded cipher. Some of it was cracked. Some of it was never deciphered. So again, you're like, okay, this guy, Jesus Christ, you know, you're seeing all the similarities. This guy, you know, his dad was an expert in code, and the Zodiac Killer wrote his messages in code. Not only that, but then it transpires that while his father was in the army, the father would send him pages of code, and the young Earl would have to decipher it before then replying to the father in code. So not only was his dad an expert in code, he was teaching his son the tricks of the trade as well. So again, you have all these little tidbits. And then it all seems fairly circumstantial to be fair. But then what it kind of comes up to, or the crescendo of all of this evidence being fired at you, is that in one of the crime scenes, I think I might be wrong there, but I think it was one of the last ones by the Zodiac Killer, he killed a taxi driver, and there was a bloody fingerprint left on the handle of the car. So Gary gets this and sends it off to some fingerprint expert, I don't know. And they obviously have his father, Earl Van Best Jr.'s fingerprints from when he was arrested for, you know, taking his ma, like running off with his ma. So they cross-reference them. And what Gary notices, being the sleuth he is, he notices that on the index finger, his father has a very prominent scar going across his fingerprint. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, on the fingerprints left by the Zodiac Killer, there's also a very prominent scar. So you're like, this can't be a coincidence. Like, you know, I remember at this point in the documentary, I was like, he's got to be him. He's got to be him. Like, there's no way this can't be him. It can't be someone else. But then on the flip of that, when I'm watching it, I'm kind of like, but wouldn't it be out in the media then if it was confirmed Zodiac Killer has been identified? So I was like, oh, there's something coming here. There's definitely something coming here. And then, and the last part, I suppose, of this section of the documentary is that Gary then, like I said, some of the Zodiac's letters were decoded and some they didn't manage to have decoded. But one of them was like one of the last ones with this whole page of cipher that was never decoded. But lo and behold, doesn't our Gary find his dad's name spelled out fully, Earl Van Best Jr., from right to left in the columns. Literally finds it like E-A, or like spelled correctly, but from back to front across the columns. And so like this is his thing, going like, look, he was literally, because the Zodiac Killer did say, like, you know, if you can decipher this cipher, you will find my identity. My identity is coded into it. And here's his dad's identity coded into it. So literally by the end of that, you are absolutely convinced his dad must be the Zodiac Killer. And like, I suppose it's actually really interesting just as well from the point of view of like how a story is sold to us, or how a narrative is sold to us. You know, it shows how easily, I suppose, people can be influenced, or people can be convinced of something. So I found that quite interesting, because definitely at this part of the documentary I was like, fuck me, has to be the Zodiac Killer. There's no two ways about it. There's no way that this can turn. Like, look at all that. That can't be coincidence. There's too many coincidences. His dad has to be the Zodiac Killer 120%. So we're kind of at the halfway mark then, say, in the documentary at this point in time. And then, as you know, there's always a turn. So the turn starts, and what happens is the director of this documentary, who is Keith Davidson, he brings in his own experts to kind of go through Gary's evidence bit by bit. And as I said at the head of the podcast, this book, it was a best-selling book in 2014. It was written by Gary, but it was co-written by Susan Mustafa, who is a renowned and well-respected crime writer. So obviously, I mean, Gary didn't have any experience in writing a book, so he got her on board. And she partakes in this documentary as well. And, you know, she's giving interviews, I should say, throughout this documentary as well, and giving her tuppence and telling about the, you know, different research that Gary had done, and, you know, when he showed her this and how her mind was blown. And so it's very interesting. You have kind of, you know, his story, and then obviously she's the co-writer with him, and she's talking you through it as well. But then what they do, as I said, the director just gets his own experts in, just to examine all of Gary's findings, because some of it is a bit mad. Like, there's no two ways about it. There's some bits of it now where you're kind of like, you're clutching at straws there. There's kind of daft elements in it as well. I suppose I've kind of whittled through the more kind of believable bits of it, but there are bits of it that are a little bit daft, and you're kind of like, that's a bit far-fetched. But what happens when the director brings in his own experts, the shit really hits the fan. This is where it really gets interesting. And up until this point, you kind of think that the documentary is just a rehashing of the book if you haven't read the book. And I think that's probably what Gary and Susan think up until this point as well. Can't talk today. What they think up until this point as well is that this documentary is just a retelling of the book, or a rehashing of the book. So they bring in this PI, and he starts looking through things. And the first thing he does is he tries to get a kind of comprehensive timeline of the father of this alleged Zodiac Killer, Earl Van Best Jr. So he's able to get a fairly comprehensive timeline up until a certain point. And then there's a gap in it. There's a gap of about 4 years where he just can't find any trace of this guy. And by all accounts, earlier in the documentary, Gary does the same thing. He finds a timeline for the father, and there is this gap as well. And wouldn't you know it, the gap is exactly pretty much when these killings by the Zodiac Killer are taking place. So again, it seems pretty compelling. It seems like, you know, this guy drops off the face of the earth for the 3 or 4 years when the bulk of these killings are being taken place. So it does look like, you know, he's gone underground so that he can commit these murders. So this detective, or this private investigator, I should say, that they employ, he goes on the hunt to try and find some evidence of what this guy was doing in that interim period. Where was he? What was he doing? Is there any compelling evidence to show that 100% he is the Zodiac Killer? Then, so he's one of the experts to get in. Another expert they get in then is because kind of earlier in the documentary, Gary talks about how a handwriting expert cross-referenced the marriage certificate that his father filled out to his mum, and also some of the handwritten letters from the Zodiac. And like, they do this thing in the documentary where they kind of interlace the handwriting from both documents as well. And again, you're kind of like, this is back where you're like, there's no fucking way this can't be the Zodiac Killer. So again, you're like, Jesus, like, yeah, look the way he does the J's are identical. Look the way he does EST together, that's identical. Like, it's pretty bang on. There are some bits where you're kind of like, nah, it's not exactly right, but you know, for the most part, it does seem to be the same handwriting. And that handwriting expert you know, kind of furthers the case for Gary, and indeed for Susan as the co-writer as well. They get their own handwriting expert in, they being the director and the producer of this. They get their own handwriting expert in, and she's like basically completely slamming the previous handwriting expert and going, there's no fucking way you could determine that was the same set, or that was, that both of those examples were written by the same person, because they're not comprehensive enough, they're not big enough. So she was saying, there's not enough repetition of the same, letter patterns. There's not, basically she's saying that, it would be foolish of any supposed expert to make a call on that little information, because all they had was the marriage certificate, which obviously it's not like it's pages and pages of writing. It's just you're filling out your name, what your occupation is, your date of birth, and then the letters of the zodiac. She's saying there's no way that that's enough to run a comprehensive check on, and that by her reckoning, it's not the same. It's not the same person. And in fact, then when they dig a little bit deeper, they find out not only that it's, not the same, but it's highly likely that the marriage certificate wasn't actually filled out by the father. Now again, Gary has told them that that's what his mother said. The mother takes part in this documentary as well, and she rubbishes a lot of the things that Gary says. Well, look, you don't know if it's her memory or if it's that, he's lying, but he's saying, look, she told me this, and she's like, I never said that. No way. I never saw his father filling out the marriage form. And then when they, like I said, investigated, they find out that it was actually the priest in that church where they got married that filled out the form, not the father. So then, unless the priest is the fucking Zodiac Killer, do you know what I mean? It kind of debunks that. The next thing then they move on to is that the name in the code, okay? And I have to say, like, when that happened, because they end one of the episodes that the father's name in the ciphered message from the Zodiac, I was like, gee, it was just, it's a brilliant bit of documentary making. Like, it really is, to end on that cliffhanger. Like, fuck, that's gotta be the Zodiac Killer. There's no two ways about it. But yeah, they go back on that and they get a code expert in, or again, I don't know what they're called, but you know what I mean. They get one of these guys in and he goes through it and he goes like, I'm not trying to be bad, but all Gary has done is gone through this cipher and matched up the symbols in the cipher that most look like the corresponding letters. Like, there's no mathematical deduction to conclusively say, oh right, that is an E and that is an A. He's literally gone for the shape in the cipher that looks like an E. He's gone for the shape in the cipher that looks like an A and an R and an L and so on and so forth. And he said if you were to do that, you could find any fucking name in the cipher. And so not only does he state that, but the documentary makers go on to actually do that. And they show all the combinations of names that could be found in the cipher if you were to apply those rules. So yeah, they come up with all these mad names and they put them along the bottom of the screen, and they spend a good minute doing that. Like, it's not one or two names. They do 10 different variations of names that could be found. And they said, like, there are like thousands upon millions of combinations of names that could actually be found in the cipher using that method. And therefore, Gary's talking out of his arse, basically, but again, when he shows it in the documentary initially, I was there with him. I was like, fuck yeah, it's gotta be his dad. Like, there's no fucking two ways about it. And then, like, you kind of feel like a gobshite. You're sitting back and going, oh yeah, look, it just shows how easily you can be sold or, made to believe the narrative they want you to. And even, like, to that end, think about other documentaries that maybe we watch sometimes, and then by the end of it we're like, I'm going fucking vegan, or that's it, I'm going off the grid. You just become so, they really sell you the dream. They really sell you that belief, and it just goes to show how fucking gullible we are and how easily we can be sold that. And even, like I said, me, who I do nothing but watch documentaries, but 2 episodes in, I was like, that's fucking the Zodiac. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like, it's got to be this. So it just shows what good storytelling can do. The Bible, for example. But you know what I mean? Like, it just goes to show what good storytelling can do, really, and how gullible we can be in the end of it all. But so that's another thing. So that's completely debunked. And then I suppose the most compelling thing is that they find out that the dad wasn't underground. The reason they can't find any record of him is because he was abroad with his new family. So he had moved to Europe, and he basically he'd married a woman, had a family, and then moved back to her home country. And that's where he was. And then being the decent sort he was, he ended up abandoning that family as well, and fecking off back to America. And that's why he then lands back in America, and that's why there's this gap in his timeline while he is in America, because he was in America. So not only has everything else been debunked, he can't be the fucking Zodiac Killer because he wasn't in the country. And so what the documentary makers do, I should also say, sorry at this point in time, the fingerprint as well, because again, that was some really like, you can't, that has to be the case. They get a fingerprint expert in, and he says, like, not only is it actually the wrong finger that the scar is on, but it's also like upside down. So it's not, Gary has just placed the fingerprint along the other fingerprint so that the scar is matched up. And the fingerprint expert says that apparently scars are very common. And, even when he said that, I was like, geez, yeah, I've got a few scars on my hands as well, on my fingers. So, fair point, I guess. And then, yeah, the last bit of evidence that Gary had going for him was that in the early 2000s, they were able to garner some trace DNA from one of the stamps from one of the Zodiac's letters. And so he submits a DNA sample to the detective who's, running this cold case to cross-reference. And then kind of doesn't hear anything back. So what the director and the producer of this documentary do is they confront Susan, Mustafa and Gary on camera with this evidence. And so Gary keeps throwing all the evidence at them, and they're like, well, we debunked that. And he's like, yeah, well, what about the fingerprint? And we're like, we debunked that. Oh, what about his name in the cipher? And we're like, yeah, another expert debunked that. And he's like, well, what about the fact there's this gap in where he was? Yeah, dude, he was abroad. And finally the bit he throws at him is like, well, what about the DNA, And actually they don't know. They haven't looked into that yet. They say this to Susan, and she is palpably furious. You can see how absolutely furious she is. She asks for a minute, goes off set, and then obviously with the mic pack still in on her, you can hear her cursing Gary Stewart's name. So what they do then is it kind of goes, 1 month later, and it shows Susan, and she's talking to the camera again, and she has contacted the head of the Zodiac investigation, the detective that's heading at this guy that Gary said has his DNA. Oh, and Gary actually says as well that this guy said that, he couldn't give him the results of the DNA test, per se, but that he could not be ruled out as, that his father, I should say, could not be ruled out as being the Zodiac Killer. So, basically saying it in a roundabout way that your dad was a Zodiac Killer, absolutely. So yeah, he talks about that. And what happens is that she sits down with the detective, and he's talking out of his arse. He's like, A, yeah, his DNA was tested. B, I would never give him the results of that. That is so unprofessional. We can't do that. Our heads will be on the fucking chopping block. But he said, I never said that. I never said that, he couldn't be excluded. He said, what I did say was that, his story is very interesting, and that it certainly makes for a good, he liked the book and all of that kind of thing. But he's like, I never told him. Basically what he's saying is that I never told him that in so many words or in a roundabout way that his dad was a Zodiac Killer. And I'm not saying that now, and we've no evidence to show that. And yeah, Susan's like, thanks very much. That's all I needed to hear, basically. And then they kind of flip back to Gary again, and it shows him in his church where he's kind of like, local boy done good. And it's interesting because the ceremony that they have is like, you can run from everyone, you can lie to everyone, but you can't lie to yourself. That's what Jesus tells you. And, again, brilliant bit of documentary making on that part that they're in, and that they get that bit of the sermon. And it shows Gary, I suppose, being, back patted and hands being shook by local, churchgoers as well. And, he's just the local boy done good. He's the man about town. He's had the bestseller, his dad's Zodiac Killer. And it's just kind of talking about how some people, when they've been through this process of being put up for adoption, they need a sense of self. They need to be someone. They need to be someone important. And it doesn't matter how terrible that person is. So it is far better to be the son of a notorious serial killer than to be nobody. And so that oftentimes they will tell themselves these fantastical stories, because it's easier to do that than to just go, actually, you know, my life was unremarkable and I was just unwanted. There was no great big reason why he had to give me up. He didn't have to give me up because he was some serial killer. He just simply didn't want me. And it's harder for them to accept that and admit that to themselves than believing a fantastical story. And I guess really that's where they leave it. That's what Gary Stewart has done. I've done a little bit of research just to see what has come about since the documentary. And I think what's really sweet is I found an interview with Susan Mustafa talking about it, and they were just kind of saying, you know, what's your relationship with Gary now, and do you believe he intentionally duped you? And she was like, genuinely, I don't. And she takes 100% responsibility for the part she played as well, because she said, I'm the journalist, I'm the professional, I should have never taken his research as gospel. I should have gone behind his back and I should have re-interviewed everyone he claimed to interview. I should have got my own quotes. I should have done my own research. But she said everything just seemed to fit into place. And she said, you know, I questioned a couple of things and he was able to give me emails proving them. And then I just stopped questioning. And she said that was really my downfall. But that she has no bad feeling towards him or no malice or ill will. That she absolutely thinks he 100% believes this. And that he didn't lie. He just wanted it to be so bad that he was able to forget about the bits that didn't make sense and only focus on the bits that did. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. So that's the lowdown of the documentary. What did I think of it? This is one of the best fucking documentaries I've ever seen. We're on lockdown at the moment. We're stuck in anyway. Do yourself a favour. Get this online. If you can't find it online, as always, I have a link. This is it's one of the most comprehensive in terms of what you're looking for in a documentary. There's murder mystery. There's a whodunit. There's this quest to find out who he is. And then all this compelling evidence. And like I said, I know it ends up not to be true, but it doesn't matter. Still go watch it. And I'd say, you know, if like me, and you probably will, get sucked up in the narrative, you can absolutely see how Gary Stewart codded himself, I suppose, really into believing he was the offspring of the Zodiac Killer. But absolutely go watch it. And like I said, if you need a link, I'll give you a link. That's no bother at all. Guys, this has been episode 2 of season 2 of What's Up Doc, the documentary review podcast. As always, I've been your host, Gemma Delaney. If you like what you hear, give us a like, give us a share. For the love of God, give us a review. And guys, we will see you in a couple of days' time. Take care. Bye now.
You coming to bed, hon?
Yep, honey, I'll be right there. Just gotta turn out the light. Ow! 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 Ah! Gah!
Some things never change. Like your kids always leaving tiny toys on the floor for you to step on.
Ow!
And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Sweetie, I think I left the downstairs light on.
Please don't make me go.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
The motto for 2022 is out with the old, in with the bold. And if you're ready to revamp your career, your relationships, or your money this year, check out Modern Life. It's a new podcast and newsletter from Fidelity Investments with fresh perspectives from people defining success on their own terms and tips to help you do the same. Search Modern Life wherever you find your podcast to follow and subscribe. Keep in mind that investing involves risk. The value of your investment will fluctuate over time, and you may gain or lose money. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC, 900 Salem Street, Smithfield, Rhode Island, 02917.